Once upon a time, in a land far, far away from Taiwan, Switzerland dominated the world watch industry. In 1974, the Swiss exported 84 million watches. It was the industry's pinnacle. Then came what they call the quartz crisis. Less than 10 years later, exports fell 50% to a low of just 30 million in the early 1980s. Devastating. But that was not the end of it. Somehow, Swiss watches returned, and even thrived. How about that? In this video, we return to the Swiss watch industry and trace its comeback from the quartz onslaught. The Swiss watch industry dates to the late 1500s. The city of Geneva in Switzerland had long been a city of merchants and fancy jewelry. But then the Calvinists, known for their austerity, took influence, and in 1558 they passed laws against evil superfluities like wearing jewelry. However, watches were deemed a practical instrument and thusly exempted, so the goldsmiths and jeweler artisans pivoted to making watches. In 1601, the Watchmakers' Guild of Geneva was founded, marking the creation of the Swiss watch industry. The industry received a major boost thanks to the French. Signed in 1598, the Edict of Nantes ended the French wars of religion. It granted rights to the Huguenots, who practiced Calvinist Protestantism, and by contrast, France was largely Catholic. But then in 1685, King Louis XIV revoked the edict, sparking a new wave of persecution. Hundreds of thousands of French Huguenots fled France for new lives elsewhere in more Protestant-friendly countries. Tens of thousands of French Huguenots chose to resettle in Geneva, bringing their watchmaking skills with them. To this day, most of the Swiss watch industry resides in the French-speaking part of the country. That being said, the industry had been just one of several others in Europe. Watch industries in Germany, England, and France persisted and were quite technically advanced. It took a combination of industrial savvy and organizational capacity for the Swiss to take the lead. Early on, Germany led Europe as the center of the timekeeping world. The oldest known working watch dates back to Germany in the 1500s. But while German clocks were beautiful, they were also unreliable. A German saying of the day went, "If you want to make trouble for yourself, take a wife, buy a watch, or hit a cleric." Germans are so quotable. Anyway, the French took over global leadership from the Germans. In 1764, the French watchmaker Jean-Antoine Lepine invented the Lepine caliber. It involved a redesign of the watch that made it drastically thinner. The Swiss adopted the technology and industrialized it. They established a decentralized mass production system known as établissage. Watch component pieces are assembled in small workshops in the Swiss Jura mountain countryside by very low-paid farmers stuck at home because of winter. The components are sent to Geneva, where they are assembled and inspected. The Swiss watch industry basically overwhelmed the French and English with mass production. In 1800, England and Switzerland produced somewhere between 120,000 to 200,000 watches each, that range. 50 years later, the British produced about the same number of watches, more or less. The Swiss, on the other hand, produced 2.2 million. This was even as the watch itself got more complicated over the years. Between 1830 and 1870, the average number of watch components went from 54 to almost 100. No way around it, the Brits simply missed the bus. Then came the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, which then showed the Swiss industry their shortcomings compared to the Americans. The Americans had tuned their production systems to make high-quality, precision watches at high volume and low cost. Admirably, the Swiss responded to this crisis by adopting these techniques themselves with great effect. By the 1900s, the French and English watch industries had collapsed, leaving the Swiss dominant in the European export watch market. In the 1920s, the Swiss watch industry adopted a vertically integrated cartel structure to combat a practice known as chablonnage. Chablonnage is where companies export a watch's movements, its most important part, for later assembly in a cheaper location like Japan. Japan challenged the Swiss with their own exported watch movements, so the Swiss cartelized their industry to prevent it. In 1926, 17 Swiss manufacturers of watch movements were put into one trust called Eboche. This failed to do the trick, so the Swiss government intervened. They rolled Bosch and other component makers into one holding company called Aswag. The government also imposed several other fairly strict regulations on Aswag to control production output volumes and cut down on the export of valuable technologies. On the other side, the Swiss government set up another trust company called SSIH. This company consolidated many Finnish watch brands like Omega, Tissot, and Lemania. This cartel formation worked, and the state-controlled monopoly industry experienced stability and revitalization from the 1930s to the 1960s. In 1940, 80% of the world's imported watches came from Switzerland. In 1969, the Japanese company Seiko released the Astron quartz watch. It was only the beginning. The 1970s then saw a wave of cheap digital quartz watches exported out of Hong Kong and Japan. Swiss jobs in the watch industry were annihilated, falling from 89,000 in 1970 to 33,000 by 1985. The Neuchâtel, Bern, and Solothurn cantons were hit particularly hard. Over 20% of their manufacturing jobs were in the watch industry. While the population in the rest of the country grew by an average of 250,000, they shrank by 150,000. Hundreds of companies vanished. In 1970, there were 1,618 watchmaking companies in Switzerland. By 1980, only 861 companies remained. 40 years of government protection weakened the industry's competitiveness. The signs were there as early as the 1950s, when foreign competition started taking Swiss share in the world watch export market. The Swiss pioneered early quartz technologies but failed to commercialize them. Based in the mountainous regions, they were very tradition-bound and failed to see change coming. It's the opposite of what happened when the Swiss were challenged by American manufacturing in the late 1870s. Until 1982, the majority of Swiss watches were still mechanical, not quartz. There were a few other contributors to the crisis. We should mention the impact of currencies. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system caused a dramatic strengthening of the Swiss franc versus the US dollar, German Deutschmark, Japanese yen, and gold. Since over a third of Swiss watch exports go to the United States, this had a negative price impact. Japanese and German watches did better thanks to their currencies to some extent. Secondly, we need to acknowledge the impact of expensive Swiss labor wages as compared to those in Asia. Hong Kong in particular became the volume leader in watches thanks to very cheap labor from China. They only entered the market in 1976, but in 1988 alone, they produced a stunning 300 million watches, more than any other nation in volume. American firms like Timex and Bulova benefited from assembling watches offshore and bringing them into their own market. This let them undercut Swiss watchmakers. The Swiss still made high-quality watches. The watch NASA chose to go to the moon was an Omega made in Switzerland. But as I mentioned, watches were everyday practical items, and most people preferred cheaper ones. Next, the Japanese watch industry structure had been more geared for flexibility and success. The industry in Japan was more centralized. In 1978, two Japanese firms, with Seiko the leader, did 88% of total watch production. They produced the whole watch from start to finish, and thanks to improving semiconductor technology, they got both cheaper, smaller, and more accurate over time. Thin, skinny quartz watches for women sold particularly well. The Swiss, by contrast, lacked that centralized mass. I earlier mentioned that there were over 1,600 firms. Their single biggest manufacturer did just 9% of overall business. That made change, new R&D, and scalable mass production difficult. The Swiss produced a few quartz watches in 1971 to address criticism, but they largely initially dismissed cheap quartz watches as a fad. Before the Swiss could formulate an industry-wide response, the Japanese had already charged headfirst. The sheer scale of production allowed the Asian powers to overwhelm Swiss artisan manufacturing. The Japanese produce an average of 6 million units of every watch brand it's sold. The Swiss, by contrast, less than 100,000. And I already mentioned Hong Kong's manufacturing prowess. High volume and low cost hit the Swiss where it hurt the most, the middle-class watch segment. Today we have smartphones, but 50 years ago, The watch was as ubiquitous as the phone. It was an essential, everyday life tool, not really a luxury item. And finally, one need also point out the Swiss distribution system, a centuries-old system that saw the mechanical watch as a piece of jewelry. Stores made money on selling the watch and repairing it, and changes to the Swiss system would hurt them. The Japanese did not have this distribution system at the start, so they found their customers through variety stores and mass advertising. It worked perfectly, as the retail revolution of the 1980s played itself out. For more information, I recommend the prequel to this video, where I take a more Japanese-centric perspective of the watch journey. As the crisis developed, the Swiss industry's two dominant companies, SSIH and ASWAG, which employed half of the industry's workers, teetered on the edge of financial collapse. After 1974, SSIH's strategy was to diversify into cheap mechanical watches, and it failed. Sales volumes fell from 12.4 million to 1.9 million. They basically collapsed, losing 161 million francs in 1980. ASWAG was the more stable of the two due to its control of the market in mechanical watch movements and movement blanks. In 1978, they appointed Ernst Thomke to run that Ebosch movement subsidiary, or ETA. A trained chemical engineer, Thomke formerly worked at ETA and returned after a stint in British pharmaceuticals. He extensively overhauled the company's structure, closing many older factories. A stunning number of jobs were lost. ASWAG employment fell from 20,000 in 1974 to 16,000 in 1980, and then under 8,000 in 1982. It was a painful transition. Thomke also commissioned new products to push their own manufacturing limits and unify the company in the wake of this pain. One of those was the Delirium, an experiment to make the thinnest watch possible. In 1978, Citizen showed off a quartz watch movement less than 1 millimeter thick. Nice, but when complete with case, it was much thicker. So the Japanese challenged themselves to cut that down and eventually went to 2.5 millimeters. I keep wanting to say process node, but we're in the wrong industry here. Anyway, the industry threw down the gauntlet for Thomke, and he challenged ETA to beat that. The ETA team thought he was crazy. Ergo, they named the project delirium tremens, a medical condition defined by a profound confusion. But the team responded. Unveiled in 1979, the first delirium analog quartz movement was just 2 millimeters thick, and a later version would be half as thin, breaking Seiko's thinness record. The first delirium was more of a luxury item and later sold as such, but the learnings soon filtered into a new breakthrough product. The same year, the ETA team embarked on a new project nicknamed Delirium Vulgaris, or the People's Delirium, or the ESA 500 watch. The spec was to produce a cheap, very thin quartz watch from plastic that was robust, reliable, and long-lasting. It would have a battery that lasted 3 years and can be replaced. And it would be priced at just 30 francs. So total cost of 5 francs at the start and 7 francs eventually. Such a thing cannot be produced with the traditional Swiss techniques. Traditionally, we build the watch's middle case first and then assemble the rest of the watch inside that case. The cost of the 99 to 150 individual parts alone before assembly was 20 francs. This did not meet spec. So the engineering team, led by Anton Bailey and Andre Boehner, produced a new assembly technique that bonded watch parts directly to the case. This technique revolutionized Swiss production, cutting the number of parts to just 51. The new technique took some time to ramp with many failures and issues. It ticked too loudly, and early models broke down at a 70% rate. And unfortunately, watches produced this way cannot be repaired afterwards, so components and modules needed to be closely inspected throughout assembly. In late October 1981, Ernst Thomke presided over a meeting between the engineers, designers, and marketing. While reviewing the design by Hans Zog, a marketing consultant with U.S. experience named Franz Sprecher coined the name Swatch. Swiss and watch. Makes sense. Sprecher went on to craft the Swatch's brand image, a cheap, fashionable accessory for the young yuppie generation of the 1980s to express their creativity and personality. Finally introduced in 1983, it was a breakthrough hit. advertised on MTV and selling particularly well at busy airport kiosks. So by the early 1980s, Aswag's recovery was well on the way, but the rest of the industry remained in business crisis. In need of help, the Swiss bank creditors recruited a consulting firm called Hayek Engineering and its founder Nicholas Hayek. Born of mixed American and Lebanese heritage, Hayek moved to Switzerland at the age of 7, eventually advising several large companies. In 1982, he delivered a report recommending that Aswag and SSIH be merged to cut R&D, production, and administration. Aswag did not want the merger. As mentioned, they were doing far better than SSIH and didn't want to be leashed to a turkey. Nevertheless, the Swiss banks running the company knew that SSIH would collapse otherwise without a merger, causing massive damage to Swiss society and themselves. So in December 1983, they created Aswag SSIH. It was a messy merger combining the two already very messy companies. Extensive reorganization work was needed, which Hayek and his consultant team took an involved role in. It took 3 years. The company lost money in 1983, but returned to weak profitability the next year, in part thanks to booming sales of the Swatch watch. In 1985, Hayek acquired a majority stake in the merged company with the help of Swiss-German private equity. The new company got a new name, SMH. I'm shaking my head at that name, and a few years later, the company changed its name to Swatch Group. I shall call it that from now on. The Swatch watch helped the Swatch Group pull itself out of its troubles, but not as much as you might think. The sale and export of non-metal watches, basically the Swatch, initially rose to about 200 million francs a year in the late 1980s. Then, starting in 1990, sales boomed. Swatches peaked in 1993 with nearly 800 million francs of sales that year, but the craze died out and sales returned to its previous steady state of 200 million francs a year. No denying that it was a success. They sold 50 million Swatches after 5 years, but at no point did plastic watches ever contribute a majority of Swatch Group's sales. What was more important to Swatch's revival, as well as that of the rest of the Swiss watch industry, was a repositioning of their legacy mechanical watches as luxurious goods rather than practical everyday items. This repositioning came about amidst a larger, more general market trend of what we call accessible luxury, meaning well-made goods priced quite high but still affordable for the public. It's no surprise that the late 1980s also saw the founding and takeoff of companies like LVMH in 1987 and Richemont in 1988. The SSIH merger gave the company two interesting brands, Omega and Tissot, in addition to the Longines brand they already had. Omega was a particular gem. The brand dates back to founder Louis Brandt's firm in 1848, and in 1930 it joined the SSIH umbrella along with Tissot. Prior to the quartz crisis, Omega was neck and neck with Rolex, the world's most prestigious watch brand. But as SSIH went deeper into its cheap and high-volume strategy throughout the 1970s, the brand began to languish. The first attempt to burnish the brand happened after the Aswag and SSIH merger. In 1984, the company released the limited edition Louis Brandt collection. It did not do well and was phased out shortly thereafter. But they kept at it, and after a series of successful auctions for vintage watches, the industry decided in 1990, that mechanical luxury watches were an opportunity. In 1992, Swiss ads featuring mechanical watches outnumbered those for quartz watches for the first time. Swatch Group repositioned its top brands to hit the various parts of the market, Omega for the high end, Tissot for the middle, and Swatch at the low end. Omega's move to the high end was handled by marketing head Jean-Claude Biver. Biver was a former product manager at Omega during the worst of the quartz crisis. In 1983, he bought from them the name to a 200-year-old watch store called Blancpain for 22,000 francs. He and his business partner Jacques Piaget then built up the brand by going against the grain. Its marketing famously declared, "Since 1735, there has never been a quartz Blancpain watch, and there never will be." In 1992, he sold the brand back to Swatch Group for 60 million francs and began building up Omega again as their flagship brand. From 1995 to 1999, he nearly tripled Omega's revenues from $350 million to $900 million. The luxury marketing strategy focused on delivering several key messages. First, precision. During the quartz crisis, mechanical watchmakers stopped talking about how precisely their watches kept time because quartz watches unquestionably did better. Omega and other companies brought back the idea of precision, but in the context of explaining the artisan craft that went into producing the watch. Dozens of parts, intricately and precisely machined, so on. Next, the Swiss luxury brands underlined heritage, which enhances a brand's timelessness. The Swiss watch industry isn't Europe's oldest, but it is still centuries old. The marketing underlined that heritage. Patek Philippe used for their Generations ad campaign the line, "You never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation." This heritage theme had the added benefit of leaning into the concept of the things being made in Switzerland, rather than abroad. Finally, companies used extensive celebrity endorsement and product placements. Early on, Omega seized on its prior involvement in the American space program, inviting Neil Armstrong and other astronauts to events. And they aggressively targeted younger consumers. Notably, they got a product placement deal with the James Bond movie franchise, starting with the 1995 film GoldenEye. Later on, Bever joined LVMH's watch division, and there he enlisted artists like Jay-Z or models like Cara Delevingne to help bring watches to the youths. These strategies largely worked. In 2008, sales of Swiss mechanical watches, made in Switzerland, retook first place in the world when measured in revenue terms. In 2023, they exported nearly 17 million watches worth 25.5 billion francs. So what happened to the watch companies in Japan and Hong Kong? The big Japanese watch companies, Citizen, Seiko, and Casio, faced a multitude of challenges. The 1985 Plaza Accord revalued the yen, hurting their price competitiveness and causing factories to move out of Japan. And then there was the popping of the real estate bubble, sparking Japan's general plunge into economic stagnancy. Then, in the 1990s, we had the rise of cell phones, and the Japanese struggled to adapt. They generally targeted the mid-range watch consumer with good quality products at a good price. This type product use case was exactly what the cell phone made obsolete. There have been a few bright spots. Casio's G-Shock brand, for instance, is known for its toughness and durability, and it continues to sell well. But overall, this market has been challenged by changing consumer preferences and new competition, particularly the Apple Watch, which hit the market in 2015 and has leveraged the iPhone's popularity to eat away at the Japanese watch companies' overall product value. Meanwhile, their home market has embraced small but complicated-looking luxury watches made in Switzerland. Japan is one of Patek Philippe's top 5 global markets. And as for Hong Kong, when labor got more expensive, those watch companies too moved their factories north out of Hong Kong into mainland China. But the Chinese consumers' thirst for affordable luxury goods has been voracious. Various luxury watch brands like Rolex and Omega opened flagship stores there, turning the city into a thriving luxury re-export center. So, starting in the mid-1980s, Hong Kong's watch export sales declined, but the re-exports soared. Hong Kong is still the second largest individual market for Swiss watch exports. There have been many business school case studies written about the Swiss watch industry's seeming miraculous comeback. Hayek's acquisition of Swatch Group, formerly a state monopoly, made him a billionaire. He is furthermore widely credited with originating and driving the company's turnaround. I probably wouldn't go that far, though. Considering that Aswag's turnaround was well underway before he entered the picture, I would sooner credit Swatch's success to Ernst Thomke, Jean-Claude Bever, and their managers. And before any move to luxury could be made, the Swiss watch industry first needed to revamp its manufacturing prowess, downscale its cost structure, and consolidate its organization. It did that, but only with immense pain. Well, that is the past. For Swatch Group and the rest of the Swiss watch industry, new challenges on the horizon. An aging population, changing consumer preferences, and new technologies like the Apple Watch. We shall see how they do. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon. and I'll see you guys next time.